Hello, this is Professor James Strickler. This is a course in American government. This course is from Unit 3 about American federalism, and it's Lesson 10 about implied powers. In this lesson, you'll learn about the United States Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland. You'll learn about the court's interpretation of the Necessary and Proper Clause. You'll learn about implied powers, and you'll learn about the impact this case had on reserved powers. Now, in previous lessons, we learned about Madison's potential solution to the problem of the national government stepping beyond its boundaries. He thought that by dividing the national government up into three branches and then pitting the ambitions of the politicians against each other through checks and balances, that they would keep each other within their proper place. We also learned about the anti-federalist critic Brutus, who claimed that the national government's branches would instead learn to cooperate with each other to expand their power outward. We then questioned whether or not Brutus was right. Would Madison's auxiliary precautions fail and the national government cooperate to expand its powers? And in cooperating to expand its powers, would the national government then take reserved powers away from the states? We then began to answer that question by looking at some historical events where the balance of power between the national government and the states changed. And the first of those events that we began to consider was the Hamiltonian economic program. The Hamiltonian economic program, which we began to discuss in our last lesson, included three elements: a protective tariff, the assumption of state debts, and the establishment of a national bank. It was the establishment of the national bank that we focused on in the previous lesson. And we asked whether or not there was a power in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that would authorize the creation of a bank. When we looked at the list of powers there, found in Article 1, Section 8, we could see that none of them actually says that you can have a bank. Learned that Alexander Hamilton argued that the last of the powers listed, the Necessary and Proper Clause, which says that Congress can do whatever is necessary to carry out its other powers, is where he would find the power to create a bank. Hamilton argued that that word necessary means useful. So if having a bank was just merely useful for the national government to carry out some of its other powers, such as collecting taxes, then that'd be good enough. While Thomas Jefferson argued that what it really means is that the power is required, that you have to have a bank in order to go do this other thing. Now, arguably, Jefferson had the correct argument here. Necessary really does mean required in the way that we commonly use the word. And so Hamilton would then, if that was accepted, have to show that a bank was really required in order to do these other things. That'd be a very difficult argument for him to make, because it wasn't like there weren't other banks in existence. In fact, there were many other banks that could have been used by the national government, banks that were authorized by the state governments. So even if it was helpful to make use of a bank in order to do these other things, the national government didn't have to have its own bank to do this stuff. While it might be useful, it was certainly not required for them to create their own bank, when they could simply use the other banks already in existence that have been authorized by the states. Yet, despite that argument, Alexander Hamilton won. A bank was created. It was established by the United States government. But even though that bank had been created by Congress and approved by President Washington when he signed it into law, there was still a question of whether or not the courts would also accept this constitutional interpretation that was put forth by Alexander Hamilton. And the opportunity for the courts to consider that came in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. In that case, the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States was directly questioned. An additional question that was raised in the case was whether or not the state of Maryland could tax a branch of the Bank of the United States that had been established in the city of Baltimore within their state. So when the Supreme Court of the United States had the opportunity to consider this case about the Bank of the United States, it had to answer two questions, really. The first question was whether or not Congress could even make this bank in the first place. As the Supreme Court decided this question, they concluded that what necessary means, in their opinion, is any means that can be used to produce the desired end. They then went on to say that among all these means that can be used to produce the desired end, as long as they aren't prohibited by the Constitution, they are constitutional. So in essence, what the Supreme Court did was they adopted a very broad, very expansive interpretation of the word necessary, much as Alexander Hamilton did. Rather than saying that necessary means that a thing is required, as we commonly would use it as we speak, and as Thomas Jefferson argued it should be interpreted, instead, they accepted the idea that it can mean things that are useful, helpful, conducive, etc. Any means that can really be used to help them accomplish their legitimate end. And as long as it's not prohibited, go ahead and do it. This loose interpretation accepted by the court has given rise to the notion of implied powers. What implied powers is about is this idea that for every power listed in the Constitution, there is a whole group of other powers that are implied by it, that while not listed, are just as legitimate. So by giving the necessary and proper clause an expansive interpretation, by accepting this notion of implied powers, effectively many additional powers were granted to the United States Congress and given constitutional legitimacy in this case. That then leads us to the second question of the case. Can Maryland tax the bank? The Supreme Court settled that question by declaring that the power to tax is the power to destroy. In other words, Maryland could put such a high tax on the bank that they could cause the bank to cease to exist. And the Supreme Court said that can't be done because of the Supremacy Clause. Remember, the Supremacy Clause is in Article 6 of the Constitution, and it essentially says that if there's an overlap in power between the national government and the states, the national government wins. So once the Supreme Court had decided that, through their loose interpretation of the Necessary and Proper Clause, that the national government could create a bank, then they were supreme in the creation of banks. And the state of Maryland couldn't come along and use its own power to somehow stop the national government from creating the bank that the court had said they were authorized to create. For supremacy reasons, the national government would then win, and Maryland could not tax the bank. So, as we look at the story of the Bank of the United States, from this lesson and the previous one, we can ask ourselves, was Brutus right? Did the branches of the national government cooperate to expand their power? Well, the national bank was enacted by Congress. It was then signed into law by the president, and it was upheld by the United States Supreme Court. So we have all three branches of government, in a sense, cooperating together here to say a bank is okay. And the result is that this bank's powers overrode the reserved powers of the state of Maryland to regulate banks and tax banks within its boundaries. So now we can ask ourselves, what does this then do to the balance of power between the national government and the states? In other words, how does it affect federalism? To answer that question, we can look at this diagram that we've previously constructed to represent the powers of the national and the state governments. Something important to notice about this diagram is that the powers of the national government are few and defined, as Madison said before. They're specific powers that were delegated, limited powers. All the powers of the state governments are large. They're numerous and undefined. But with the introduction of this idea of implied powers, the powers of the national government are dramatically expanded. Suddenly, they don't just have the powers that were specifically delegated to them, but a whole host of other powers that they can claim are necessary through a very loose interpretation of that word necessary. Now, as they expand their powers, they in effect decrease the power of the states. They take reserved powers from them. Previously in this course, we talked about the amendment process found in the United States Constitution. And we pointed out how difficult the amendment process was and how that was specifically done to prevent the national government from easily adding new powers to itself. Well, by getting implied powers, the national government has found a way to increase its powers without having to go through the difficult amendment process. So now let's review what we learned. What did McCulloch versus Maryland concern? Was it about a national bank? About a protective tariff? About steamboats routes? Or about appointment of judges? It concerned a national bank. How did the court interpret the necessary and proper clause in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland? As any means enumerated? Only those means required? Any means not prohibited? Or any means not vetoed? The court interpreted it as any means not prohibited. What are implied powers? Are they indirect powers, delegated powers, enumerated powers, or expressed powers? Now, the answer here might not be so obvious because we didn't directly use this terminology in the lesson. But by process of elimination, the answer is obvious. Implied powers are not delegated powers, or enumerated powers, or expressed powers. Those are all explicitly mentioned. Instead, implied powers are indirect powers. Powers that can be used to help out with some other thing, that are implied by it without it being explicitly said. What impact do implied powers have on reserved powers? State powers are expanded. National power is contracted. State powers are contracted, or individual rights are expanded. State powers are contracted. In other words, as the national government expands its powers through the notion of implied powers, it's gobbling up powers that belong to the states. So the states have less and less power. So their powers are contracted, in other words, made smaller. That does it for this lesson about implied powers. The next lesson from Unit 3 will be Lesson 11 about the Civil War.